Tonight on a very special Fanatic Forum, it's the Multiverse fundraiser for 2024, and we are doing comic books for kids. It's our main charity tonight. We're very exciting night here, so we have got a very special guest. Marvel artist Bob Hall is on here, so a lot to talk about. But first, we got to talk about this. Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to the Fanatic Forum. I'm your prime fanatic and host, George Buehler. Thank you all for joining us on a very special evening here. This is the Multiverse fundraiser for 2024 here. A very important time for us here at the Cereal Box Network because basically we pick a charity every year. And this year's charity is Comic Books for Kids. Of course, if you are a normal viewer of the Fanatic Forum, you know we promote comic books for kids on here all the time. An absolutely stellar charity here. And of course, you check out the link here at the bottom of your screen here, and you can donate to Comic Books for Kids as well and be a part of this here. We have a very short video we're going to play for you, and then when we come back here, we get to talk with Marvel legend Bob Hall. So stay tuned, folks.
My name is Mark Weiss, and I'm the president and founder of an organization called Comic Books for Kids. Our complete entire mission is dedicated to providing comic books to kids in hospitals and cancer centers. I've been passionate about comic books literally my entire life. I love the industry, I love the mythology of the characters, but I've always also wanted to give back. And it occurred to me that perhaps something could be done that would allow us to create an organization that allowed us to provide comic books to the kids in hospitals and cancer centers. And I asked them, I said, if we were to provide comic books to you, would you like them? Every hospital I called had the same story. Please do this for our kids. My goal at the time, a year ago, was to deliver 1,000 comics in a calendar year. By the way, I had no inventory. To 20 hospitals, which, by the way, I hadn't contacted, and bring on 2 publishers. That was my 2017 goal. As we wrapped up 2017, we shipped out over 8,000 comics last year to over 100 children's hospitals in almost every state in the country, and almost every publisher that is here today is working with us. Our community tab on our website shows stories from nurses, from children, from mothers of students, patients, children who have had their lives touched by the simple, small act of kindness of just giving them a comic book. The stories are incredible. You can't make this up. And if anyone had ever told me that we would be influencing people's lives by just these small acts of kindness, I don't think I would have ever recognized the impact. I feel very humbled and very flattered that we've been able to touch so many people's and children's lives. And I never thought the responsiveness would be what we are seeing. It's about letting kids be kids again. And it's about bringing comic books back to the kids.
Yeah, just an absolutely wonderful charity. So, like I said, the scroll here on the bottom here gives you your link to how you can donate to Comic Books for Kids. Just absolutely wonderful charity, and just puts smiles on faces of children who probably in some rough spots there, and hopefully help them pull through here. But now, folks, we have got ourselves a very special guest here in the Fanatic Forum. Probably one of the authors of my childhood here, because looking through my comic collection, his work is all over it. So I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you folks to Marvel legend Bob Hall. Bob, thank you for being here tonight, sir.
Good evening. And can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I hear you just great.
Okay.
So again, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Pleasure. Yeah.
So let's get starting off here. Before you even became an artist, before you even became a playwright, you were a fan of comics. Do you remember how you got into comics, or maybe even what your first comic was?
Well, especially since you're giving comic books for kids, I thought you ought to hear this story. When I was about 4 years old, and I could have been 3, I could have been 4. It all blurs at that point. I remember some of that better than I remember 5 years ago, though. I became very ill, and I was vomiting blood. And so, of course, my parents were terrified. And I see I've got cat hair on my shirt. Just ignore it, please. And they took me to the emergency room, and I was checked in, and they didn't know what was wrong with me. And the next day I felt fine, but they said, no, you're still sick, after checking me over and taking all the temperature and stuff. And they said, you're really quite ill. And I said, well, I don't feel ill, but I was at that age jumping up and down on the bed and everything and wanting to get out of there. And so they kept trying to pacify me. And they found that the thing that would really pacify me was to bring me comic books. And so I eventually was there for about 3 days. And while they still couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, I had stopped vomiting blood, thank God. And this stack grew of comic books that and it was a wonderful collection. The one that I remember, because I was 4, was Carl Barks' first Donald Duck, which was Donald Duck and Pirate Gold. It was based on an actual cartoon that I think never got done, but Barks did it. And of course it was beautiful. And I recognized that somehow, that this was really special. But then there were other stuff, some of them really appropriate, like early Superman and Captain Marvel. And some like Crime Does Not Pay, that were completely inappropriate for a 4-year-old, but I didn't, and I couldn't even read, so I was just looking at the pictures. And then they were going to run more tests on me, and were starting to wheel me out. And the nurse saw me scratching behind my right ear, and she looked and said, "Oh, I think we better get the doctor in here." And the doctor came in and looked behind my ear and said, "You have measles."
Oh, no.
What I had was called intestinal measles. And so they were measles that hadn't come out. And all of a sudden they were coming out. And the doctor said, "You're going to be fine in a couple of days, and you got to go home. And measles are the most contagious thing going. So you have to take all of those comic books home with you." And that was it. That was the curse of my life, or the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm not sure which. But that's how I got acquainted with comics.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, it's funny. I always notice that, a lot of, because I work in a comic book store, and I notice a lot of folks who come in looking for Disney comics, they're usually asking for, Goofy or Mickey Mouse. I'm like, well, it's like we've got quite a lot of Donald Duck, Huey, Dewey, Louie, and Uncle Scrooge, because apparently those gentlemen won the popularity contest.
They were, of course, Carl Barks is one of the true geniuses. If I rate geniuses in comic books, there's Jack Kirby, there's Carl Barks, there's Eisner. There are a few people who go beyond. You were mentioning Steranko. I think he fits in that category. Okay. But from those days, the people that, and Barks was still, I was so pleased when they started reprinting them. And I said, I'll buy a batch of those and see if they're just as good. And they feel even better now because there's nothing like them being done. And Barks was brilliant at doing something that operated both on a kid's level and on an adult level as well. So, which is what I think comics should do. But there you go.
Absolutely. We've got one fan comment here. Craylin McDonald says that she got to meet you a couple of years ago. You're kind and talented, the whole package. So,
well, I'm talented, but she must have got me on a good day about the kind business. I don't know about it.
Good point. Good point. I've got a question here from Sci-Fi Queens. Do you still have those comic books from when you started collecting? When you first started reading?
Nah, for one thing, this was the early 50s. And actually, it may have been even the late 40s when I was ill. And as I got older, the collection was amazing that I had. I didn't know it was a collection at the time. It was just my stack of comics. But there was this huge Salvation Army in town, and you could buy comics from the 1940s for 2 cents a piece. And I would come home with shopping bags full of them. And I don't even want to think about what some of them were. But of course, this was pre-Dr. Wortham. And when it was decided that comic books were rotting the minds of American youth, my mother went through and religiously tore almost all of them up.
Oh no!
And tossed them away. So, and the rest of them went when I went away to school. She finally was able to clear out those drawers. So I don't have any of them. I think when my mom finally she had to go into a home, and I started cleaning out the house, I thought maybe I'll find something. And I found one jumbo comic with Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, on the cover, and I picked it up, and it fell to pieces in my hand.
Oh no!
That was the end of my misspent youth.
Oh, alas. That Sci-Fi Queens replies, "Oh no, that is terrible. So sad." Oh,
It's terrible and sad, but very typical of people from my era. We just, those things. If you didn't have, I think my dad would have kept them forever, but mom just thought, why are you wasting your time on these comic books? You're ruining your eyes, and you'll never get any work, and blah blah blah.
no.
You know, if the idea that I would be doing this for a living, she just missed out on it. She was had Alzheimer's, and it was just before I got my first job with Marvel. So I regret that. And Dad was long gone. So
Yeah. Well, Sci-Fi Queens does comment here. It says, "But look at where comic books has taken you now." So there you are.
But maybe good, maybe bad. I think good.
Well, speaking of comic books here, we do have I do have some of your work here because, like I said, I dug through my own collection here. So if you remember some covers here, if you have any stories about some here, a very famous Avengers cover.
We don't talk about that one. We don't talk about that.
Oh, don't talk about that.
No,
All right.
no, we can talk about it. In fact, every interview I do, we talk about that one.
Of course.
That's the famous one where the Wasp got slapped, and Shooter claims that he didn't intend that, and I claim that he did. And we're very good friends. We have dinner every time we're at cons together. So I think we've agreed to just let that be a permanent controversy, and it never seems to go away. I'm still amazed that 40 years later, people are still saying, "How could you have done that?" And
it's just good storytelling. You know, it's an unfortunate story, but it's still good storytelling.
well, it's not too bad to have done something that's truly, it's the most truly iconic comic that I've done. It's the one that changed things. It was one of the first ones that admitted that the private lives of superheroes were something other than Leave It to Beaver. And it started a whole milieu of it going in that direction, which I think was a good thing, but it was a very dramatic way to start that. And maybe that's how things work in comics. So they don't start, they start with a bang, not with a whimper.
Indeed.
Or they don't take, you know.
Yeah. Well, and it always seemed to be something that Marvel was at the forefront of anyway, where their characters are much more human and, addressing much more real world problems, drug use and, spousal abuse, things like that. So,
yeah. Well, a few years later, I was doing Squadron Supreme that really went that
series
of what if, and of course, Mark's Gruenwald's what if was, what if Marvel had been doing the Justice Society or the Justice League, and what would it have been like? And I don't know if that's what it would have been like, but it sure was fun to do, and great fun to do characters that were less than trademarks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lots of chance to do good visual and psychological things with them.
Absolutely. And actually, one book here that, of course, a team you kind of became almost synonymous with, the West Coast Avengers, even though you really only did the original miniseries.
Right. Well,
But, oh, sorry,
yeah.
go ahead, please.
No, Justin, it was. I that was one that I wished I could have continued with it as a monthly, but by the time they decided it had legs, I was doing Squadron Supreme, so it wasn't me. It turned out to be, I guess, quite a few different people, but the first one was Milgram,
Absolutely.
and it had a different flavor as the monthly because Roger wasn't doing it, and not that isn't bad. It's just it was quite different. Roger had a certain feel to the stuff that he did that was very Rogerish. He was one of my favorite people to work with because he made it very easy for an artist,
I can,
in the sense that his storytelling was very clean, very crisp. He gave you enough room to develop it and to do stuff. So this is one of the first things that I did that I was rather satisfied with.
absolutely. And of course, a character that you had a bit of a hand in as well that kind of really took on her own life within the West Coast Avengers, Miss Bobby Barton there, Mockingbird.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, we've got a special guest just to come in and visit and say hello here. One of our producers, but also doing a little bit of Mockingbird cosplay herself, Kelly Gettner.
Hey, Bob.
Hello. You look very Mockingbirdish.
Thank you. I don't know if you remember meeting me a few years ago, but when you met me, I had purple hair.
Oh, yes. Now I recognize.
And yeah, the glasses do it.
So yeah, Secret
Classic
Identity. They're
Mocking,
supposed to, yeah.
exactly. Classic Mockingbird is definitely still coming, but I just wanted to pop in and thank you for being here.
Oh, sure.
You are just wonderful. We're all excited to have you.
Oh,
Oh, thanks, Nita. Nita
good to
from
be here.
Sci-Fi Queens that says, Kelly, you look amazing. So sweet.
And you do. You do.
Thank you. You really did have a hand in creating Mockingbird or carving out Mockingbird to who she is today. So that's awesome. Like,
I liked the character, and I think the most fun I had with her was when a few years later I did Emperor Doom and graphic novel, and there was just more of a chance to develop her in that series, I think, than even than in the first West Coast things. So yeah, one of my favorite. Her along with Wonder Man were two of my favorite characters because they were underused. So those were always fun characters to get a hold of and be able to play with.
I feel like that's where you excel, is kind of taking those underused characters and then making people appreciate them more.
Mm-hmm.
Do you kind of have a soft spot for the B-list characters?
Yeah. Well, I've always thought of myself as a B-list person. So
Same.
In a sense, really, I would be in the best supporting actor category, and I like being there. I think that's probably where I belong.
Bob, Crayley's actually got a good question here since we're talking about women in comics here. She loves that you drew women with realistic muscles. Did you ever get any pushback for how you would draw women in comics versus maybe some more popular styles that came later on?
Only once, and it was very late on when I did something called Time Walker for Valiant, and I was just writing it. And I wanted, there was a Sean Connery movie with this wonderful actress in it. And of course, I'm blanking on her name, but it was an older woman that was in charge of this space station that he was on. Somebody can call in and they'll remember everything about it, as they do.
Outland was the movie, wasn't it?
Outland, I think, and I can't remember Frances Sternhagen was her name.
Oh, yes.
Wonderful actress, and I'd actually met her in New York, and I wanted to base this one character in Time Walker on her. And by the time it came out, the editor had called Don Perlin, who drew it, and wanted her to said they said, Bob, she just wasn't babelicious. We need some. We're in trouble. We got to sell books, and we need some quote babelicious women in this comic. So that's the only time I ever got any pushback, which I think was unfortunate. I thought that was a great idea to be featuring. You know, the old thing, you feature somebody featuring women who are in their 50s, who I now think are 50s and older. That's that women are great. But it just was not common to see people of that age in comic books. And I tried, but it never happened.
Bless you for trying. Thank you. As a woman.
But I always felt
getting up there.
I remember, forgive me, this is kind of a crude story, but when I learned, I got into the business at Marvel through John Buscema, who taught a class in how to draw comics the Marvel way, like the book that eventually came out. And that was, I think, why he did the class was Stan wanted him to write a book. And John said, I'd have to go back and teach because I've forgotten what should be in the book. And so he was in a class, and a kid came in with a drawing of a pinup of a superheroine who would have had to walk around with a wheelbarrow in front of her. I mean, it was just ungodly huge breast.
Yeah.
And John, I could see John trying to struggle with it, and he's her breasts are kind of big. And the kid said, well, it's a superhero, and aren't they talking? And John said, on the whole, this is this Brooklyn gruff guy. On the whole, I would say that the rule of thumb is don't make her boobs bigger than her head. And I thought, well, those are words to live by. But it made me very self-conscious about, let's not have everybody have had implants of some kind. Let's try to make people somewhat human.
There's stylized, and then there's just ridiculous.
Ridiculous, yeah. There was a lot of ridiculous in the 70s, just because the all of a sudden the business was being run by fanboys. That was a good thing. That wasn't a bad thing, but it was different, and it took a while for the adolescent fantasies to work themselves out a bit.
And then they all came back in the 90s again.
Well, yeah, there.
And the 70s was also when they started loosening or started removing the Comics Code Authority.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that happened. Actually, that happened before I got into comics. I got into comics in 1974, and they had already done the Spider-Man drug story, which was the breakthrough, and then followed by Denny O'Neill's Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and those were the ones that just destroyed the code. Once they had done those, there was no point in the code anymore, and that was probably a good thing. But in some cases, it was a license to let's go nuts with
the floodgates.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Exactly. Sci-Fi Queens actually has an interesting question here. What was the hardest lesson you've learned when you started that you are grateful now that you've learned it?
Never make her boobs bigger than no. It's the biggest lesson I learned was very early on. There was a guy named John Forpurton who was the production manager at Marvel, and he was an imposing character. He was a man of few words, and he was very gruff. You eventually discovered he was a pretty nice guy, but of course he was having to deal with these artists, for gosh sakes. So a certain gruffness was appropriate, and I was assigned. Now, when I first started, there was a problem that I had trained with John Buscema. Buscema was one of the fastest people in comics, and not only was he fast, but he was at his best doing crowd scenes, the Avengers. He could draw multiple characters with ease. And so because I had trained with him, they assumed I could. And it took me a long time before I could do it. I would get these things, and I was never as fast as John. Nobody was as fast as John, but except for Kirby. And I was assigned very early on. So it was the first year I was working there, a Fantastic Four annual, and I literally couldn't finish it. I did about 6-7 pages, I think, and it didn't look to me like the Fantastic Four. I knew in my head just what they should look like, and I erased and erased and erased and redrew, and it still to me didn't look like the Fantastic Four. And finally I realized I am obsessing with this, but I can't stop, and I'll never get it done. And I had to take it into John for Purton and say, I can't finish this. I will never get it finished. It doesn't look right. And he was, oh, don't ever do this again. And they took it back and assigned somebody else to finish it. And then I saw it printed, and they had printed everything that I did just as I had drawn it. I mean, inked, but and that what they wanted was they wanted it done.
Right.
And that's a hard lesson to learn, because you go in and you really want to be Rembrandt. You want to do your best work, but what they wanted was done. And eventually, Jim Shooter, when he took over a few years later, asked me to be an editor. And that was when I realized my job as an editor, which I was only willing to do for 6 months because that's another story. But I learned more in those 6 months. And what I learned was that everything got behind in comics, because for most people, getting a comic done in 2 weeks was really hard. And you eventually got burned out, staying up till 3 a.m. to do it. John, by the way, got up very early in the day, worked till 5, and that was it. He never did, but he could do that. And that was important in the sense that, not that you wanted to say, oh, well, I'll just turn in whatever I do, I'll turn it in. But you did. And eventually you got better, and eventually you got faster. But you just had to close your eyes and say, okay, I have got 22 pages done. They're done. I'll go on to the next thing. I asked John once how he got to be so fast, and he said he and his brother Sal, when they first were starting out, they'd sit around the kitchen table and they'd use an alarm clock, and they'd set it for a certain time. And when the alarm clock went off, the panel had to be done. And I said, my God, were they any good? And he said, no, they were terrible. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, we turned them in. I said, did they ever send them back? No. He said, and we got better. We learned how to be good and fast. But we had, in order to do that, we had to close our eyes and turn in what we produced, and let them be the critic, and let them be the judges as to whether it was good or not good. And to survive in the business, I think you had to have some of that attitude that they hired me. What I did is probably something that they like. Let's see what they say. And you'd go ahead and turn in stuff that sometimes and then after, I think it took me close to 10 years that I was finally feeling, I'm going to turn this in and it's going to be good.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
That's one thing that's always amazed me of watching a professional artist. It doesn't matter who it is I've seen over the years, just the speed at which you all work has always just been amazing to me. And like you said, you have to kind of learn that speed when you're working in the industry. So yeah.
Well, I think there were people like me that had to learn it. And I never. I at a certain point I said, I'm never going to get any better if I don't do some stuff outside of comics. And I took a lot of life drawing because like a lot of people in comics, part of the thing that slows you down is you'll be trying to say, how do I judge if it's any good? Well, I'll imitate Neil Adams, and if it looks like Neil Adams, then we know it's good. Now the problem is that there was already a Neil Adams, and you're not going to be as good as Neil Adams unless you have Bill Sienkiewicz. You know, and there were people who came in, John Byrne, for an example, who was good and fast from the beginning. So that made him a despicable person, in my opinion. And, no, but you would admire those people and say, how the hell are they doing that? Where did they learn to do that? Well, part of it was just metabolic, and George was like that too. How can you get anything in on time and be putting all of that stuff in the background? But eventually you learned your own way. And once I had more of what I've considered my own style, it was easier to get faster because I was judging it based on my own standard, not somebody else's.
Excellent point. Well, shifting gears a little bit here, because of course,
Wait, George, sorry to interrupt you, but I need to pop off to get ready for my next panel. I am so sorry. Bob, thank you so much again.
Good to see you again.
I adore you. You are amazing. George, thank you for letting me jump in and
absolutely
enjoy the rest of your interview.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate you. I'll pop you out of here. All right. Yeah, she told me she wanted to pop in as her Mockingbird cosplay. I was like, oh, of course.
Oh, yeah. That's cool. That's cool.
But yeah, to shift gears a little bit here. So, of course, you're very well known as a comic artist, but before then, you're basically a big theater fan because you've been a director, you've been a playwright. So I really would love to talk about your career and basically how that all started.
Well, I found it was something I could do. Mm-hmm. I was one of those kids that I was crappy at sports, and was constantly looking for something, an identity. And part of my identity was realizing that I could draw. And while I had to really work on anatomy when I finally got into comics, I was good at portraiture. I had eventually done, as I got more and more into theater, I did a lot of scenery design, and that gave me a base to work from. But I also discovered, almost by accident, that I had a distinct ability to act, and I wasn't that I was a good actor. I don't think I am a good actor. I think I'm a good dialectician, and I have a good ear for language. And I had been sent to an evangelical church starting with the time that I was about 7 years old. It was a church called the Citywide Gospel Tabernacle. It was directly in front of our house. And you've got to understand, my folks didn't go to church. They just felt I should go to church. And I won't get into it. It was like, for a couple of years, I was panicked that everybody was going to hell. And until my father caught me praying one day, and he said, what you doing? I said, praying. He said, well, that's okay. What are you praying for? I don't know. But you can go to. And he said, look, you have to go to church because your mom wants you to go, but don't take it too much to heart. And that was the first, total cognitive dissonance. It was like, but then why am I going? I don't understand. But anyway, we had to memorize all these Bible verses, and it was the King James Version of the Bible. Well, that's Shakespearean language. Right. And when I got to high school, we were studying Shakespeare, and our teacher asked us to read it out loud. And I think she was almost being funny, because assuming that people would have a terrible time with it. And I found I had no problem with it at all. I absolutely understood that language by that time, having never been ill when I was a kid. I never even had a chance to skip Sunday school. I'm sure they were convinced I was going to be a minister. And that one thing led to another. And my speech teacher said, well, you've got to try acting. And so I tried acting and found I was pretty good at it. And that became a real identity thing for me in high school. and they sent me to the University of Nebraska. I was from Nebraska, and they did a summer program with kids, and one of my first roles was playing the lead in this thing at the university, directed by a guy who had been a professional director. And I said, well, this is it. I want to do this. And eventually realized that what I really wanted to do was direct, that I was a good storyteller, but I was better at making sure that story happened than I was at acting. I began to not enjoy acting nearly as much as directing, and so and I was really good, and I decided I would go to New York and attempt to do this. And I went to New York, and in fact, I did start getting work fairly quickly as a director. The problem was that it paid, the beginning thing paid almost nothing.
Wow.
And so I asked one guy who was, I met this guy who was prominent as a director, a guy named Andre Gregory. You can see him in a movie called My Dinner with Andre, a sort of documentary thing. And I said, Mr. Gregory, what do I have to do to be a director in New York? And he said, well, I don't know how anybody does it if they're not independently wealthy. I married a chocolate heiress. I don't know what you're going to do. And it remained some of the best advice I ever got about working in the arts in the United States, is that it's a constant battle to get enough money, to raise enough money, and comics also just paid. I think my first jobs were like 20 some bucks a page, and it's difficult. It's almost as if people are saying, let's see if you really want to do this, because you're going to have to survive through being not making much money or blah 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 before you get someplace where you can actually make a living at this stuff. And so I went to New York, and I realized that there was the catch to this, that you did, unless you went and you were wealthy, you had to get a job right away, because the cost of living in New York was, to somebody in Nebraska, seemed outrageous. You thought you'd brought enough money, and you were amazed that a week later it was gone.
Yeah.
And so I'd go out to visit my friends, and they were, the first thing they had to do was get an office job, usually temping. And they'd say, well, I'm an actor. I need to go audition. And usually people would say, oh, well, you can work temp. That's fine. But they would get tired of that after you were there for a few months. And if you were any good, they would start to say, well, why don't you just work full time for us for a while? Then they would offer you insurance. And 20 years later, people would find out that that's what they'd done with their lives. And I said, I've got to figure out something else. And this is a crazy way to get into comics. But a friend of mine said, well, why don't you draw comics? You can draw and you can tell a story. So, and I hadn't read any comics since I was 12 years old. I'm from that era when you just stopped reading them when you were that age. Yeah. And it was only maybe 5 years. It was 5 years too early for the idea that you would go on with this. And when college students started reading Marvel comics and blah blah blah, and so I looked at these things, and he gave me, the first thing he gave me was a bunch of Barry Smith Conans. Barry Windsor Smith he is now, and of course John Buscema stuff, and Bernie Wrightson. Neil was doing everything. Joe Kubert was doing Tarzan. It was and Jack Kirby, of course, was doing the New Gods. And you can still find a bunch of his Marvel stuff still around, and you looked at it and you said, "Oh my God, this is not the comics that I grew up on.
Right.
I'm not good enough to do this, but I want to be, because it combined everything that I had ever loved doing, and so I began to work, and then one thing led to another, and I started after a bunch of portfolio stuff, and I would take the portfolios to Comic Cons, just like people do now. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of the first people I talked to and showed a portfolio to that made a difference in my life was Jerry Conway.
Wow.
I showed him some stuff, and he said, "I think you could do this," and that was enough to last me through another 6 months of rejections. Was somebody in the know thought I could do it, and then I started getting work at Charlton, and that was before Buscema's taught the comics course. So I took the comics course, and then from him, and then he got me the job at Marvel.
Absolutely. Well, there's been a couple of more comments and questions in here real quick. First off, Sci-Fi Queens wants to add that as someone who lives in New York City, the cost of living is still too high.
Oh, I was living in the 90s when we were all making a lot of money for a while. I had a contract with Valiant and realized that I could live anywhere. It was really fax and FedEx. Once the internet, of course, became common, that made it even easier. But as long as there was a fax and FedEx, you could live. You didn't have to live in New York anymore. But I love New York. But I had always wanted to live in overseas, and I went and lived in England and Ireland for 3 years. And while I was there, this is too long a story, and I won't get into it. But I found out I was adopted, and by that time I was in my 50s, and I thought I've got to go back and find out something about this. My folks were long dead, and my adoptive parents, who were wonderful people. My only disappointment at finding that out was that I wished they had not kept it a secret. I was from an era when, if you were illegitimate, it was considered such a disgrace that it would scar you forever. Maybe it did. Maybe that's why I went into comics. I don't know. But I'm kidding, of course. But it was all the records were sealed. So I decided I would go back to Lincoln and try to find something out. This was around the year 2000. And while I was in Lincoln, comic books completely fell apart, and I wasn't getting any work anymore. That was when the collector's market exploded.
Right.
And all of a sudden, the cost of living in Lincoln, Nebraska looked awfully good to me. And then I had the chance to start a Shakespeare festival. And because I had been coming back to Lincoln in the summers, and the university asked me to come back and be the artistic director of their summer theater program, which was a great combination because I could do comics all year long and then slow it down just a little bit in the summers and have my cake and eat it too. And so I was, but that's my comment about New York and I go back now and I say, how does anybody live there? And it's, and I know how, but you have to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I've never been any good at making a lot of money, although I'm better now through comic cons than probably I have ever been. Except for that period in the 90s when it was insane. What you all of a sudden, people who had been saying, how can I keep doing comics and still make a living? All of a sudden we were getting these royalties that were beyond belief because it was another number one or the introduction of a new character, and everybody thought they were going to put their. I don't know what happens to collectors. It's like they all wake up the same morning and call each other and realize they all collected the same book, and that what they thought was going to be worth a lot of money is worth a little less than the market price. And then it begins to be dominoes. Then it just topples.
Yeah. And those always, to me, in my opinion, those always seem to be the fair weather collectors, folks that just grab the number one. They didn't really care about the rest of the series, that sort of thing like that. And in the 90s, they were printing hundreds of thousands of books. So we unfortunately tell a lot of people today, they still come in with books, and we see a lot of 90s stuff, and they're like, well, fortunately, most of that's not really worth much of anything. And so we're transparent with that sort of, but yeah, it's always been.
And of course, it's not comics, just comics. It's any collecting stuff that becomes huge like that eventually is likely to burst. The one of the first international monetary crises was when the tulip market exploded in the 17th century. And that's been the model for almost every other baseball cards, Beanie Babies, comics.
Yeah, everything.
But if you're a collector, be careful, guys. Don't go buying Porsches. It's a mistake.
Exactly. Well, speaking of comics, of course, you've had such a wide range of different titles here, but Clyde Hall wanted to recognize and say thank you for helping make The Human Fly one of his 70s guilty pleasures.
It was one of the more fun and odd things that that was when I was an editor. So I was the editor of it. The best thing about it was that it was out of continuity. It was not a superhero book. And there were all these guys, and now I can really appreciate this at my age. There were these guys from the 40s and 50s trying to get any work in comics. And I think actually now a bunch of them could do stuff and it would look great. But this was the 70s, and even Jack Kirby seemed out of style.
Yeah.
Frank Robbins seemed out of style, but they would give me Frank Robbins to work with. They would give me Bob Luberts to work with, Lee Elias, people like that. They would, Jim Shooter would send them to me because they could work on The Human Fly. So I got to meet these guys that I was buying those 2 cents worth of comics from the Salvation Army. They were the people that were drawing them. And I began to recognize that and just be thrilled to be working with them. The Human Fly himself was a real person that Stan had apparently met at a party and thought, what a great idea. He's like an Evel Knievel, and we can do a book about him. And he was supposed to keep doing stunts. And we were supposed to base the comic on stunts that he did. Well, first of all, that's a pretty terrible idea because that's not a plot. That's something else. But he kind of stopped doing stunts. And my job was to call him up and say, are you doing stunts? Because we can't keep doing this book if you're not doing stunts. And then he showed up at the office he had a sidekick named, I can't remember exactly what he was called, Flyspeck or something. And he really looked like the Human Fly had picked him up in a bus depot someplace, and that you thought this is getting to be trouble. There's going to be a scandal, and we're going to be in the middle of it. And then finally, I thought, well, there's an out. We can say we're going to cancel the book because you're not doing things. He said, no, I'll do one. And then he called me and said, I'm going to fly coast to coast, strapped to the wing of a Boeing 707. I'm going to do that on Easter. And I said, okay. Hung up, and I thought a while, and I looked at a couple of the other editors and told them what he'd said, and said, should I tell him he's going to die, or should I just let him do that? And of course, finally, somebody sensibly told him that this was not, first of all, nobody's going to let him do it. And second, he's going to die if he does it, and blah, blah, blah. And that was sort of at that point that we canceled the book. But it was a fun little ride, both in the experience and getting to work with all those guys.
Absolutely. One quick one more viewer question here. Bradley Smith wants to know, what do you think of artists who have a much edgier form, either in their style or maybe in their sense of humor when it comes to art, versus the more classic style that you were familiar with?
Well, one of my best friends in the business is Howard Chaykin, who I think epitomizes that. And there's nobody edgier than Howard. Mm-hmm. If you run into Howard and he doesn't say, "Hi, how are you doing? You're an idiot." There's something wrong. You feel you've missed. So that's really kind of all I care about anymore. Frankly, is it can be the humor, it can be the but I really have had my fill of the superhero trope. I don't mean I dislike it. It's made a good living for me, and I still love doing sketches of those for people at conventions. But I don't think I would be the best person to be doing a superhero monthly comic anymore. I just feel there's a certain point where you feel you've done it, and at that point you're probably doing it by rote after that. And so I'm trying to do some stuff. I think if you want to see where I would be trying to go and where I'm trying to put some stuff together, we'll see what happens. Find issues I did for Valiant. Well, even the Shadow Man stuff was pretty strange sometimes, and I could be quirky. I was getting to both write and draw my own stuff for the first time, and it was a character that wasn't necessarily a trademark. Captain America, you can have all kinds of new stuff happen to him, but his character is pretty well defined. Now, I know there are people who say, "Oh, I've changed him completely." You look back, they haven't changed him completely. They've gone this way or that way, and sometimes going this way or that way just pisses everybody off, because you say, "No, he's my pal. I want him to be, But and I'm kind of tired of that. But so later, I did something called Armed and Dangerous. I think it's the best work I ever did.
Absolutely.
And was unfortunately when Valiant was going out of business, so the print runs got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But if you can find them, I think it illustrates where I ended up with Valiant and what I would like to be doing, because I think it is quirky. It had a sense of humor, but it was much more easy for me to delve into parts of my own life. I don't mean that it's about me or autobiographical in any way. It's just that who is this character? Well, it's somebody that I've known. And that's really all you've got to make things unique, is using your experience. Anything else if you try to do it, I'll try to be unique. Well, you're probably not going to succeed. But if you're working within those things that you really care about, or you're using, my first girlfriend, I want to work her in, or the girl that I worked in, the girl that I was always secretly in love with, but never had the guts to talk to when I was in junior high, or things like that. I hated my gym teacher when I was in junior high. I thought he was a sadist, and I was pretty plump back in those days, and he had fat boy teams, and he would make fun of us and stuff. And I carried that grudge with me into adulthood, and finally I had the West Side Mafia blow up his car. And but it was like a passion, I could really, it was one of the things that was more a part of my life, but you use those things, and I think those are what make you a little quirky and a little different, and the humor is less generic, because always the problem, the biggest danger in comics is that you're building on the shoulders of all these people, and it's very hard not to be one more person doing Cap or something. And so finding the way that you can do something unique. And I really appreciate those people who changed everything, people like Frank Miller, who all of a sudden you said, oh, we can do something very different. And those would be your inspiration.
Wonderful. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here, but before we wrap up, I did want to bring on one more special guest here. The main reason why we're here is, of course, we are supporting Comic Books for Kids this year as our charity, and the charity's founder, Mark Weiss, wanted to pop in and say hello here.
Hello.
So, Mark, hello.
Pleasure well, listen, George, thank you. And anytime I can be in the same headspace as the legendary Bob Hall, I am honored, humbled, and flattered. So, Bob, it's a pleasure. It's been a joy. I've been a friend of yours, even though you've never known me for many years. And I am really struggling with Armed and Dangerous, because a little known fact is I probably have almost every Valiant comic printed. And I'm wondering if that's Valiant or Acclaim, because I don't remember.
It's Acclaim. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think of it.
Okay.
I think of the whole thing as valiant.
I understand. And it's interesting, but because when I think of your career, I have to put Shooter's name next to you at a point because they're so almost, I'm not going to say synonymous, but you've done a lot with Jim.
Yeah, I have, and we're still, in spite of the Wasp being slapped and the controversy, we're still. In fact, we're probably closer friends because of the controversy than.
It's yeah.
Yeah.
But that's just incredible. I did want to ask you because I did join early on, and I while I appreciate your humility in grading yourself a B minus, you're not. To get to the head of the class, to get where you are, it's not only that you're the A plus. Okay, now there may be a tail that goes way up there, and you used Miller and you used Chaikin and some legendary names. But Bob, I got to tell you, when I heard you were going to be on here, you're right there. I mean, you're one of the few people that I know that can write, pencil, and ink their own book. I don't know many people that do that. Okay. And you've done it many times. So just a joy to say hello to you and to thank you for being on this and helping support our initiative and what we are trying to do.
Thanks. Well, thanks for. It's a privilege to be working in the same program with somebody who's doing for this kind of work for kids. So thank you for what you're doing too.
Absolutely. You had some incredible questions, George. I feel I don't even want to talk. I want to let anybody else ask Bob the questions because I'm the I'll be the eye candy, okay? But Bob's the legend. Okay?
No, I'm the eye candy.
Wait a minute. Sorry, my head got too big. Bob's not only the eye candy, but he's the legend. All right.
There you go. I'm just here. I'm just going to hang and just be in the room.
Yeah. We're just occupying airspace. But if there's any other questions for Bob, I'm going to step back and let people ask because he's the man.
Well, we were talking about human fly earlier. Clyde said that his sidekick was named Mercury.
God, people know everything. I can't remember half this stuff. Oh, that's great. That's great. Mercury. Yes, that's right.
And Sci-Fi Queen says we're all eye candy. So thank you, Sci-Fi Queen. Appreciate
it. Sci-Fi Queen.
Bob, how did you get started? I mean, you started with. I mean, I want to say it was Charlton, wasn't it? I seem to recall you were involved with Charlton at some point.
Yeah, I did. I did several horror stories for Charlton. That was very important to my career because one of the things that did. Now people post stuff online, and what that does is it proves that you can finish a story, get it done. And at the time I started, it was important to let Marvel and DC know, hey, this guy gets a job, he can finish the job, except for that Fantastic Four fiasco that I did. But you are capable of getting to the end and making the whole thing work. Because there are a lot of people who get 2 pages and just say, oh God, this is like awful. And people who get over that can do it. But the hard part is just getting the work done, and that's the first stage of everybody's career.
How did you get that first job at Charlton? I mean, what? And then after you got it, were you like, was it incredulous? Was it I can't believe I really got a job or doing what I love?
No, I think that. Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure I got the job through some people, and I can't remember exactly who, Bob Layton, Roger, people who were working for Charlton that I had shown my stuff to at conventions, connected me with the editors at Charlton and said, you can probably get work there. I think when I first got to work, I was more numb than anything else. I was saying, oh my God, I've got to do this well. The big deal was when it came out and hit the stands, when you saw yourself actually published and it was on a newsstand in New York. Maybe even somebody bought it, it was like, oh my God. And then you realized, especially being in the theater, that more people might have seen that first comic than had seen all the plays I'd directed put together.
And what I mean, back in the day, you're working for Charlton. What's the book paying you? I mean, $100, $200, $500. I mean, it's nothing. It was nothing back then.
Yeah, I really don't remember, but I know it was some insanely low.
Right.
And I think, I'm not sure it was even made it to $20. I think it was actually somewhere in the teens.
Oh.
But you were getting the work. You were actually getting paid something. I can remember my first wife was, God, she supported me so much with office work and stuff like that. And I remember they got that job, and I told her what I was getting, and I saw her eyes go kind of like, oh my God, we've been waiting for you to get some work, and now you're getting work, and it's like it won't even buy groceries.
Yeah, right.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. Actually, we do have to end our little party here.
Stop. Yep.
No, we've got some more panels that are coming up here. Actually, Mark, you're on the hot seat here in a couple hours because you've got your panel coming up here to end our evening. So,
well, George, thank you for your participation. To those who are watching, a pleasure to say hello and thank you for supporting this initiative. And Bob, an honor and a pleasure to finally, after many years, look at the legend and let him know how much joy and escapism and creativity you helped so many of us experience. So thank you for everything you do.
Very good. Yeah, and that's why I enjoy doing these shows, because you get, for one thing, you get the feedback from people, and it's great. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, we'll be back.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I'll sign you out here.
And good night.
Once again, thank you very much, Bob, for being here. It has been an honor and a pleasure, sir.
You're welcome. Do it again sometime. I'll be happy to do it.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we're going to sign out here from the Fanatic Forum. But like I said, we've still got much more panels to tune into. So keep tuned into the to the Multiverse fundraiser. So you all have a good evening. Thank you, folks.